Chapter 171. Maisie made her way to him and got down on her knees in front of him weakly. There was no telling if she was scared or something else. "Where did you go, Waylon? How did this happen?" "I'm sorry, Mommy. It was my fault that Daddy was hurt." Waylon's tone was so calm that it was terrifying. It stunned Maisie for a moment. What happened to him? Meanwhile, the doctor walked out of the ward. "Who is the family of Nolan Goldman?" Maisie stood up fearfully. On the other hand, Quincy walked over in the meantime. "We're all his family. May we inquire what happened to him?" The doctor had a stern expression. "We've already dressed up his wounds and given him a blood serum injection. It's fortunate that the snake that bit him isn't very venomous, or else not even doctors could save him. We will still need to keep him for observation for 2 more days to monitor his condition." Nolan was bitten by a venomous snake. Maisie pursed her lips tightly while her face appeared to be rather pale. "The venomous snake bit Daddy because he was trying to protect me. I would be bitten by the snake if not for Daddy." Waylon lowered his head. Even though he had plotted on his father getting injured, he did not expect that his father would throw himself on him to shield him from the venomous snake and roll down the hill with him in order not to let him get hurt. Waylon raised his head to look at Maisie as if he remembered something. The unyieldingness in his gaze vanished while he choked on his words. "Mommy, even though I didn't like Daddy before this, he saved me. Is he going to die because of me?" Waylon had wanted to take a risk, but what should he do if his father were to die because of him? Maisie wrapped her arms around him. Waylon was sobbing soundlessly in her arms, despite barely shedding a tear in her presence. Mr. Goldman Sr. arrived at the hospital in a rush with Colton and Daisy. The old man inhaled sharply after learning about the situation. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," Waylon apologized. Mr. Goldman Sr. made his way to the front of Waylon, raised his hand, and rubbed Waylon's head. "It's an accident. It's good that you're fine." Nolan didn't know how long he had been unconscious, and it was already dark outside when he woke up again. He turned around to find Maisie sleeping propped on the bedside and could not help being stunned for a moment. He pushed himself to sit upright slowly, and the commotion woke Maisie instantly. She looked at him. "You're awake." Where's Waylon?" The first words from Nolan were about Waylon. Maisie looked down. "Waylon is fine, thank you for saving him." Nolan's gaze changed. "You're thanking me, huh? Am I an outsider or the father of the child to you?" Forget it, I won't be hearing anything good from you anyhow. So it's better for you not to speak." Nolan did not want to be infuriated by her. It was better off for him to remain calm and recuperate from his injuries. Maisie bit her lower lip and remained silent for a short while before she answered, "I know that you're the father of the child. And I can see that, you're good to him. So, haven't you realized how I'm treating you then?" Maisie gnashed her teeth upon noticing Nolan's fussy expression. "I'm talking to you about serious matters. Don't divert the topic of conversation again." "I don't want to listen to you talking about something else then." Nolan turned to his side and lay down with his back facing her. Maisie was astounded. Since when did Nolan become so arrogant? She stood up. "Nolan, I'm hungry." Maisie was stunned before she remembered that he had not eaten. Thus, she walked over to the bedside table where the food tray was. She picked up the tray and made her way to the man with his back facing her. "You're starving, right? Eat." Chapter 172. Nolan sat upright slowly, looked at her, and enunciated word by word, "Feed me." If this was the past, Maisie would have placed down the food tray and said to him, "Suit yourself." However, she did not say anything this time. Instead, she sat next to the bed and personally spooned the food to him. She felt rather shy as he stared at her from such a close distance, so she explained, "I'm only doing this reluctantly for Waylon." Nolan gulped down the food she fed and stared at her without looking away while cracking a smile. He suddenly realized that it was rather nice for him to be injured. When he was done with the meal, Maisie put the food tray away. Nolan gazed at her as he leaned on the pillow and rested. After noticing that she stayed, he said, "Are you staying to keep me company? Do you think I'm doing this willingly?" She would never stay had he not gotten hurt trying to save Waylon. Nolan narrowed his eyes and suddenly tugged away the blanket, revealing the empty space next to him. He patted on the bed. "I'm lending the half side of my bed reluctantly for you to sleep tonight." Maisie was rendered speechless. Nolan continued in all apparent seriousness. "I'm an injured patient. There's nothing I can do to resist if you were to do something to me." Maisie was lost for words. "Screw you, why didn't you just die from the venomous snake's bite, huh?" Maisie refused to get into the bed with him regardless, so Nolan did not force it on her either. He then turned to his side and slept. Maisie leaned against the wall and looked out the window. It seemed that she would really have to spend the rest of the night sitting here. Perhaps it was the cold, and she shuddered and curled up to sleep on the sofa by the side. She had not slept well the previous night and was fatigued. So she fell asleep soon. Nolan opened his eyes slowly and turned over to look at the woman curled up on the sofa. He could not help thinking to himself about his way of captivating her heart. He wondered whether he was doing a bad job or she was ignorant. Perhaps he should spend some time getting to know her. Noticing that she was shivering in the cold, Nolan got up from the bed and walked over to pick her up back to the bed. He laid down next to her, tucked her in the blanket, turned over, and curled up next to her. Nolan furrowed his brows tightly at the sight of her curling up in his arms and rubbed herself against his chin. This woman was born to torment me. It was a calm and peaceful night. When Maisie woke up the next day, she opened her eyes only to find Mr. Goldman Sr., Quincy, and the three little kids looking at her curiously in the room. Maisie suddenly sat upright only to discover that Nolan had one arm around her. She was sleeping on his bed. Mr. Goldman Sr. chuckled and said, "It's fine, sleep in, I'll take the kids to stroll around." "Cheers, Mommy." The three kids left with Mr. Goldman Sr., Quincy followed from behind in haste. Maisie was rendered speechless. Soon afterward, her hysterical voice was heard coming from the room. "You're a scumbag, Nolan Goldman." Mr. Goldman Sr. ordered the servants to prepare a spread of scrumptious lunch on the day Nolan was discharged from the hospital. Quincy and his younger sister, Sherry, joined them at the table to celebrate Nolan's return. Mr. Goldman Sr. turned around and said to Maisie, "Thank you for taking care of Nolan for the past 2 days, Z." Maisie stopped for a moment before she said smilingly, "It's all right, sir." Sherry, who was wolfing down food, looked up and said, "Maisie, shouldn't you be addressing him as Dad?" Quincy gave her a playful pinch. "Not even the food can stop you from speaking." Maisie felt rather embarrassed. Mr. Goldman Sr. chuckled and said, "That will happen sooner or later, we're not in a rush." Whoa, so it turns out that Mr. Goldman has yet to captivate his wife, huh? That's really funny. Sherry could not refrain from mocking Nolan at the dining table. She almost burst into loud laughter right there, and then Mr. Goldman Sr. would have kicked her out of the house had he not treated her like family, right? Chapter 173. Nolan's expression was solemn. Quincy gave her another pinch and said through his tightly gnashed teeth, "Eat." Sherry remembered something else, so she said to Maisie with excitement, "Please allow me to introduce myself, madam, my name is Sherry Lawson. And I'm the younger sister of this idiot. Mr. Goldman is like a big brother to us, and we have a strong friendship, so please don't misunderstand us." Maisie cracked a smile. Whoa. Sherry's personality is rather feisty indeed, and she is quite loquacious. She looked toward Quincy. "So you have a younger sister too, huh?" Quincy was frustrated. "My sister has always been with the troops all this time, so she snuck out of there to check you out when she found out that Nolan was coming home with you. Will you please speak properly?" "I came after seeking permission from my commanding officer." Sherry was displeased. Quincy cast her a look. The commanding officer would have penalized you if not for his friendship with our elder brother. Daisy chuckled and said, Aunt Sherry. Why are Uncle Quincy's name and yours so strange? Sherry wrapped an arm around Quincy's shoulder and said to her smilingly, I have no idea either because our parents named us. My eldest brother is named Hans, which is a biblical name. I'm lucky that they named me Sherry instead of Honey. For being so sweet. Colton and Daisy held back their laughter. Maisie looked toward Quincy and said, So, could it be that Quincy is? Nolan said nonchalantly, he's named that for being quirky. Huh. The people seated around the dining table could not refrain from laughing. Quincy shoved away Sherry's hand and said with an embarrassed look on his face, Fine then, you're better at making conversations than I am. Show some respect to Mr. Goldman Sr. here, will you? Can't you spare me some reputation? Why do you always have to expose my inside story anyway? Mr. Goldman Sr. was not offended either by the young people joking around. After all, the laughter made the place feel livelier. They returned to the royal capital of Bassburg after the meal. Maisie looked out the window in the car. The initial plan had been to stay for 2 days, but they had stayed for an additional day because of Nolan's injury. However, after spending 3 days with them, she discovered that she could interact with them in harmony and joy despite not being a real family. On the other hand, her real family members were conspiring against each other. What's on your mind? Nola raised his hand and ran his fingers through her hair. Her soft, silky hair glided through his palm and felt ticklish. Maisie turned around to look at him but looked away rapidly after meeting his gaze. Nothing, it's just that, your family seems to have a close relationship with Quincy and his sister. Nolan narrowed his eyes, chuckled softly, and said, Their parents used to work for my grandfather, but they were unfortunately killed in an accident. My grandfather adopted and raised them. Maisie was stunned. She looked at him in astonishment because she had no idea that Quincy and his siblings had a past like this. Nolan pulled back his arm and sat up straight. Hans is the eldest brother of Quincy and Sherry, and he's now working as my grandfather's bodyguard. Quincy is a meticulous person and is able to handle tasks in good order other than being slightly talkative, hence, I have him work for me. As for Sherry, the silly girl doesn't like to be tied down with work, and that is why she has been hanging around doing nothing with the troops all this time. Maisie lowered her gaze. Nolan, I've always been very curious, what sort of family are the Goldman? The others claimed that the Goldman family was on par with the Boucher family, whether it was their status or power. However, the Goldman were different from the Boucher in the sense that the Goldman were not a noble family. They had risen to fame later on. How had the Goldman attained their current status? By engaging in normal business. Nolan took a side glance at her and parted his tightly pursed lips to speak. You'll know in the future. I'll ensure the safety of you and the children regardless. Maisie was stunned for a moment. She pondered but did not comment further. Chapter 174. Maisie's ringing phone interrupted the ambience in the car at this very moment. The caller ID showed that it was Kennedy. Maisie could not help looking solemn when she picked up the call and heard Kennedy's voice. Uncle Kennedy. Maisie arrived on the 16th floor and saw that Kennedy was discussing something with the other staff members. Kennedy halted his discussion upon hearing her voice and stopped working on the task on hand to walk toward her. You're back. What's going on? Maisie assumed a stern expression. How had something like that happened when she was only away for 3 days? Kennedy said with a stern expression, I have no idea what happened either. It's the Lucas family. Other than Taylor Jewelry, they stopped all our suppliers from supplying mineral raw materials to us. The Lucas family? Maisie assumed a solemn expression. Could it be related to Willow? She was under the assumption that Willow would behave herself after experiencing those incidents initially. Yet, Willow had actually begun to make trouble again by relying on the Lucas family. The supply of mineral raw materials in our storage won't last for a week, and we won't be receiving those mineral raw materials 1 week later. It's estimated that the customized jewelry our customers ordered will be delayed. Kennedy did not expect that the Lucas family would brutally suppress them just because of Willow. The only reason the Lucas family had no respect for Nolan was because of Madame Lucas, Larissa. There's no need to delay our customers. Maisie crossed her arms and said, "We still have a week's time, right? Since our suppliers are breaching our contract due to the Lucas family's oppression, we shall seek compensation from them for breaching the contract then. The Soul Jewelry Studio may be a newly operating jewelry business, but it did not signify that they would just submit themselves to the mercy of others." Meanwhile, at the Goldman mansion, Nolan's gaze turned cold upon hearing Quincy's remark. "The Lucas family is brutally suppressing Soul Jewelry Studio?" Quincy nodded. "That's right. I figured that it was due to Willow. Willow is dating Louis Lucas now, right?" Nolan's expression turned somber at the mention of Willow. At the thought of how the woman had deceived him and taken Maisie's place 6 years ago, he wished that he could choke the woman to death. He interlaced his well-defined fingers and squeezed so hard that his joints were popping loudly. He gnashed his teeth in anger. Since the Lucas family is going against Z in this matter, I'd like to see how Larissa's going to react when she finds out that Z is her niece. It would be fine even if the De Arma did not value Maisie. It would be enough that the Goldman valued her. His woman needed not to be affiliated with the De Arma at all. Since Larissa had the audacity to bully his woman, he would not be bothered to show respect to her either. At Millennial Gemstone Inc., you must be joking to ask for double the compensation for breaching the contract. A raging, highly agitated voice resounded from the chairman's office. The middle-aged man tossed the breached contract document on the table and stood up. "I can see that you have a rather huge appetite for such a small company. It was you who reached out to us to collaborate in the past. We agreed to supply your company out of respect, yet now you have the audacity to come asking for compensation?" There was a hint of anger in Kennedy's eyes. "What do you mean, Mr. Parker? There's an official contract that clearly states that if there is a breach of contract on either party, the compensation will be doubled accordingly. Moreover, it was you who breached the contract first." Mr. Parker chuckled and said, "How is that related to us? It was you who offended the Lucas family. You may take from them if you have the balls." Kennedy was exasperated and about to say something when Maisie, seated on the sofa with her legs crossed, removed her sunglasses and cracked a menacing smile. "It seems that I have overestimated Millennial Gemstone since Mr. Parker won't even take contracts seriously." She stood up slowly with her arms crossed. "Since Mr. Parker isn't willing to terminate the contract according to the terms stated, we shall follow the legal procedures then, shall we?" Chapter 175. While we're at it, we'll show everyone what sort of crook Millennial Gemstone is that the company refuses to give compensation after breaching a contract. Noticing that she was planning on making a big deal out of this, Mr. Parker was shocked. He had no choice but to calm her down. Hey girl, we're all businessmen here, so why do you have to go as far as that? I can give compensation, but doubling the amount is. I'm taking double compensation, and I won't leave even if there's a penny less," said Maisie coldly. Millennial Gemstone Inc. was planning to renege on the deal because the Lucas family was their backer. Moreover, Mr. Parker did not fear Soul Jewelry because it was an unknown, small company new to the market. Yet, he did not expect that he would encounter a woman that would pester him incessantly. He figured that he should not be blamed for her gullibility. Mr. Parker grunted. "If you wish to go to court, you're going to have to win the case too, let me tell you this. You're not going to do better than you are now after offending our company." "Is that so?" Maisie fiddled with the sunglasses in her hands and smiled. "Very well then, I hope that you won't regret this, Mr. Parker." Upon saying that, she left with Kennedy. Mr. Parker let out a grunt in contempt. He refused to believe that a small, new company was capable of anything. Yet, his secretary came to report to him in a rush not long after Maisie's departure, Mr. Parker dash. Before his secretary could finish her sentence, she was shoved away by a few bodyguards dressed in black. Khan then entered Mr. Parker's office with his lawyer. Mr. Parker was stunned. He stood up slowly. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and made his way to Mr. Parker's table before passing his card. Mr. Parker accepted the card in a daze. Darian Golding ESQ, from the Royal Legal Fur, is that not the lawyer who works for Irwin? Darian placed a writ of summons on the table. Mr. Parker, the Soul Jewelry Studio has entrusted me to negotiate the breach of contract with you. I hope that you will engage in discussion with a clear mind this time, Mr. Parker. The meaning of his statement was that if Millennial Gemstone Incorporated still insisted on not abiding by the compensatory damages listed in the contract, the company would absolutely lose the court case. It was because not anyone could afford to hire a lawyer from the Royal Legal Firm. Mr. Parker leaned against his seat in a daze with sweat trickling down his temples. How is that possible? A small jewelry company was actually affiliated with Irwin. He realized that he was in trouble. In the car, I didn't expect that Millennial Gemstone Incorporated could be so shameless. Had it not been Irwin Lincoln, they would have regarded us as pushovers. Kennedy was still aggrieved while he drove. Maisie chuckled and said, Millennial Gemstone has the audacity to deny the compensatory damages because they have the Lucas family as their backer. I figured that the Lucas family convinced Millennial Gemstone by promising to pay the compensatory damages, right? How could Millennial Gemstone have the courage to breach the contract and disregard the contract if the Lucas family did not back them? Perhaps they had convinced them to breach the contract by agreeing to pay the compensatory damages for them. On the other hand, Maisie's studio was newly established, and they had not advertised that they were a jewelry studio under the umbrella of the Black Gold Group. In the past, Millennial Gemstone had agreed to collaborate with them by supplying raw materials to them for the sake of money. Other than betting on them being newcomers who could be easily bullied, Millennial Gemstone was also betting on them not having the courage to go against the Lucas family when Millennial Gemstone refused to pay the compensatory damages. A call was received in the meantime. Maisie smiled at the sight of the caller ID and picked up the call. Hello? Ms. Vanderbilt, we can discuss compensatory damages again properly. Don't let this trifling matter affect our relationship by taking it to court. The person calling was precisely Mr. Parker. Maisie smirked after noticing how courteous Mr. Parker sounded when he spoke. Mr. Parker, we're going to proceed with the court case since we've agreed to take it to court. You've seen how our Soul Jewelry Studio is not easily bullied. You chose to breach the contract and refused to pay the compensatory damages, so it's not our fault for doing this. Chapter 176. Ms. Vanderbilt, Ms. Maisie hung up without hesitation. Kennedy laughed and said, You really are turning into your mother. She was not going to let herself be taken advantage of. At the Lucas family's mansion, Goldman, have you gone mad? Larissa stared straight at Nolan. He just used Maisie to threaten her. Was he trying to openly challenge the Lucas family and even the de Arma? Nolan crossed his legs and leaned backward. If you insist on going against my fiancé, the Goldman will happily play along. Larissa's expression darkened. For a woman, have the Goldman lost your senses? She's my woman, which means she's a Goldman, what do you think? Nolan slowly picked up his teacup and took a sip before saying, the de Arma should know how reasonable U.S. Goldmen are. Especially your father, right? Larissa's expression darkened even further. It was true, the Goldmen were not reasonable people. That was especially the case of his grandfather, Titus, the man who had rough and cruel hands covered in the blood of countless nobles. In the eyes of the nobles, the Goldmen were definitely unreasonable. Nolan put down his teacup, fixed his sleeves, and stood up. Mrs. Lucas, if you insist on targeting Maisie, I hope you won't regret it when you discover new information in the future. He left after saying that. Larissa frowned. What did he mean? Mr. Parker suddenly called her and broke her train of thought. After she picked up, something Mr. Parker told her shocked her. What did you say? Erwin has been helping her. Mrs. Lucas, please save me. I breached my contract under your instructions, but now Ms. Vanderbilt won't let me off. There's also Mr. Lincoln, Mr. Parker was devastated. He had been under the impression that she was just a newbie, but Ms. Vanderbilt wasn't someone to be bullied. He was stuck between a rock and a hard place now. Since Mrs. Lucas was the one who had requested him to do this, he had to talk to her. Larissa was in deep thought. Erwin from Norwich, but why would he be helping that woman? Nolan left the Lucas mansion with his bodyguards when Willow was coming back. When she saw Nolan, her heart skipped a beat. She smiled and said, Nolan, are you here to see me? Quincy, who was standing beside them, couldn't help but roll his eyes. Who gave Willow the courage to be narcissistic? Seeing that Nolan was looking at her without saying a word, her heart beat faster. Nolan still cared about her. However, when she recalled what had happened at the auction hall that Nolan had seen her walking with Louis, she explained. Nolan, don't worry, I'm just related to the Lucas family, Louis is just my cousin. She looked up and smiled. Nolan, I know that I'm not good enough for you as a child out of wedlock, but don't worry, one day I'll get there. Do you think you're part of the De Arma family? Nolan coldly cut her off. Willow was stunned. Her smile faded and was replaced by paleness. Nolan. Nolan's lips curled as he mockingly said, Louis's cousin is just a niece to Larissa. Do you really think you're part of the De Arma? Chapter 177. Quincy gasped. Willow is a De Arma, shouldn't that be Maisie? That's why the Lucas family is helping Willow. She pretended to be Maisie and went to them. That woman really doesn't understand the concept of humility. Nolan, Your mother was Marina De Arma? Nolan stared at her coldly. It was as if he was seeing through her, giving her chills down her spine. Willow's legs almost gave way. Nolan squinted and said, I seem to remember that Maisie's mother was Marina. Isn't your mother Layla, huh? You're really trying hard to get what doesn't belong to you. Hadn't she pretended to be Maisie 6 years ago? Now she was reusing the same trick and stole Maisie's identity again. Nolan was glad that he had dodged a bullet, looking at her disgusting face. He would have hated himself otherwise. Willow held out a hand to hold him. Nolan, no, I was just Dash. Nolan took a step back to avoid her like she was the plague. Don't touch me with your filthy hands, you're nothing compared to Maisie, you will never be good enough. The humiliated Willow shuddered from head to toe and bit hard on her lip. Don't take what doesn't belong to you, even if you do get it, you'll have to return it one day. Nolan left without looking back. Willow lost all energy in her legs and collapsed on the floor. Her hands clasped tightly in fists. Her eyes were filled with hatred. Maisie, I'll make you disappear. In the afternoon, Soul Studio was in a legal battle with Millennial Gemstone. Millennial Gemstone was trending on Twitter because they wouldn't pay the penalty fees for breaching the contract. The netizens were angry, mocking Millennial Gemstone for getting into this court case because they looked down on a new company. They received a lawyer's letter very soon after that. They were requested to pay the compensatory damages as stated in the contract within 3 days, and the amount was double the amount due to their breach of contract. The contract was posted in black and white online, along with the breached terms. Even the signature and the stamp were authentic. That showed that Millennial Gemstone had agreed to the terms of the contract, but since they breached it and refused to pay the penalty, the owner was crowned debtor Parker. Millennial Gemstone was being so badly mocked, they had to come out with an official apology. Although the Lucas family had requested the other suppliers to stop supplying to Soul Studio, they were not as compliant as Millennial Gemstone since the latter, the biggest supplier to boot, had been Citizen. Example. Since Soul Studio was able to hire the lawyers from the royal legal firm, it showed that this new company had some backing. After Kennedy hung up, he entered the office smiling. The other suppliers will continue supplying us. It looks like using Millennial Gemstone as an experiment really did work. They didn't need to hunt them down one by one. All they had to do was to set an example. And the rest wouldn't dare breach their contracts anymore. Maisie smiled, but was curious. Uncle Kennedy, who do you think Uncle Irwin really is? She had visited Irwin to help find her some legal counsel, but the ones that he knew were the heavyweights. Chapter 178. Maisie wasn't afraid of offending the Lucas family. Someone had to be responsible, but she didn't expect that Irwin would get the royal lawyer involved. Still, Mr. Parker would probably inform the Lucas family, so would Irwin be the Lucas family's next target? Kenny paused and slowly replied. I'm not sure either, I just know that he has a complicated background. Maisie suddenly asked, do you know my mother's identity then? Kennedy and Irwin knew her mother. Irwin knew that her mother was a de Arma, but what about Kennedy? Kennedy looked down and shook his head. I don't know your mother's past, she never mentioned her family. Maisie wanted to say something, but she received a text. It was from Nolan. Maisie walked to his office. Just when she was going to push the door open, she heard a woman's voice. She paused. Wasn't that Linda's voice? Nolan, Maisie doesn't like me, she asked me to do the heavy lifting, can I come here? Maisie, who was standing outside, pressed her lips together, hearing everything clearly. She had really overestimated Linda. She was just like the others. Nolan's voice said, why doesn't Maisie like you? I don't know, Grandma says that she doesn't have a good temper and isn't good at flattery. Grandma was afraid that she'd make you angry too, she probably doesn't listen to everything you say, right? But I would. The office door opened. When Linda turned around and saw who walked in, her expression changed. She felt so guilty she couldn't look Maisie in the eyes. Maisie walked to the desk, put her hands on them, and said, you asked me to come over to show me this? Nolan's lips curled. What do you think about this? Linda nervously explained, Maisie, that wasn't what I meant, help me, Nolan, Why should I help you? Nolan looked cold. Who do you think you are to me? Linda shuddered, but still tried to look innocent. Furthermore, Maisie and I are very much in love. Nolan pulled Maisie into his arms. Maisie was stunned, but he pushed her head down on his shoulder before she could react. From an outsider's point of view, they really did look very much in love. Linda bit her lip, on the verge of crying. I love this temper of hers, it's adorable. Nolan hugged her tightly. Maisie didn't know what to say. Linda looked like a clown, so she turned around and left crying. Mr. Goldman, can you let go now? Maisie said, clenching her jaw. That man didn't seem to hear. Moving his fingers to her chin, you heard, your cousin was being dodgy. Maisie's eyes fluttered. She lightly pushed him away and looked at him. Don't men love women who are demure? Who said that? Nolan narrowed his eyes and hugged her tight. I like women like you. Nolan. Let go of me. No. Chapter 179. Maisie pushed his face, that was coming closer to her, away. Nolan was stuck to her like glue. Quincy walked right into a sappy scene when he opened the door. Maisie and Nolan both looked toward Quincy. The air froze. Quincy backed up and closed the door. Maisie pushed Nolan away and calmly said, show's over, I'm leaving. Wait, Nolan pulled her hand. Maisie turned around curiously, but saw him smiling. Don't you want to know about the Lucas family? The Lucas family? Maisie paused. Did he ask to see me because of them? You found out? Maisie looked down. She could keep nothing from him. Mrs. Lucas is your mother's sister, Larissa, one of the de Arma, Nolan said. Maisie froze on the spot upon hearing that. Larissa de Arma. Her mother's sister. Maisie had only found out that her mother was a de Arma before this, but didn't know about her sister. She finally learned that Mrs. Lucas was her mother's sister. But she was the one helping Willow. Nolan stood up and walked toward her, pressing his hand on the desk around her. Willow stole your identity, she lied and said that she was the daughter of Marina de Arma. Maisie looked up at Nolan in surprise, but was curious how the Lucas family hadn't suspected Willow until now. She was filled with complicated emotions. Nolan ran his finger over her lips, caressing them. Z, if you mind, I can help you take back your identity. Maisie paused, but seeing that Nolan was serious, she looked down and smiled. Nolan, thanks for telling me, but I'll take care of Willow. Nolan squinted. You think I'm useless? I never said that. Nolan looked hurt. Then why can't you rely on me, just this once? He put his head on her shoulder. Maisie was stunned. This man was showing his soft side. No one could handle that. She cleared her throat and looked away. If you want to help, then go ahead. The next day. At the Siberian Palace Hotel's restaurant. Madame Nera and Maisie were enjoying high tea in a private room. I heard that the Lucas family wanted to give trouble to your jewelry studio. Did you offend them? Madame Nera asked. Maisie put down her teacup and smiled. I wouldn't say offend. It was just that my design was the same as Willow's during the auction. The Lucas family is backing her, so they were trying to snuff me out. I'm curious now. Madame Nera looked at her. What happened between your designs? Maisie didn't want to hide anything. So she admitted everything to Madame Nera. After listening to her explanation, Madame Nera was surprised. Her design was yours too? Yes, I gave it to her. Madame Nera seemed to understand but couldn't figure it out. Is there a grudge between you and Willow? Maisie looked down and calmly said, she's my stepsister. She and her mother tried to frame me. I was just returning the favor. I was supposed to be the victim, not Pearl Santiago. Hadn't I been cautious? My reputation would have been ruined instead. Chapter 180. Madame Nera nodded. She heard about Pearl's scandal, but she didn't expect that it was related. Madame Nera hummed, the Lucas have lost their minds for helping a thief bully you. Larissa is moving farther backward the older she gets. Maisie didn't say anything. The Lucas family was helping Willow because she pretended to be someone she wasn't. Maisie never thought that Willow would lie that she was Marina's daughter. It seemed like she thought Stephen didn't know about her mother's identity. But don't worry. Taylor Jewelry always appreciates talent. Even if the Lucas family asked, I wouldn't comply. Maisie felt relief. The other jewelry companies might be afraid of the Lucas family, but Taylor wouldn't. Maisie smiled. Madam, you wouldn't renege like the rest of them. After the high tea session, they left the private room together. Maisie pushed Madame Nera's wheelchair and enjoyed a chat with her, with a few maids and bodyguards behind them. However, Maisie frowned when they saw Willow coming toward them. Willow didn't expect to see her here. So her expression changed. What are you doing here? She looked at the old woman in the wheelchair. Wasn't she the owner of Taylor Jewelry? She had thrown her out of Taylor's the previous time. Maisie scoffed. You don't own this place, why do you care what I'm doing here? Willow shook with anger, but she remembered something. She crossed her arms and sneered. Haha, you're just clinging on to Taylor now that your company is being cornered, old woman, aren't you afraid of what the Lucas family will do if you help her? Willow sniggered. She couldn't wait to see the day when everyone would leave Maisie in fear of the Lucas family, giving her no chance to get back on her feet. The female bodyguard standing behind Madame Nera walked to the front and said, You watch your mouth. Madame Nera held up a hand to stop her and smiled. You look familiar, aren't you the wild woman who caused a scene at Taylor? Who are you calling wild? Willow was burning with anger. How dare this woman look down on her? The Lucas family is blind to be helping a rude woman like you. Madame Nara wasn't cutting her any slack. Maisie couldn't hold in her laughter. Madam, don't be angry, her mother didn't teach her well, so she's here showing her ugly side to you. How dare you mock me? Willow gnashed her teeth. I'm not afraid of you just because you have Nolan and Madame Nara. You're going to feel pain if you offend me. Madame Nara spoke before Maisie could. I wouldn't blink even if you sent 10 Lucas. Go, get Larissa to meet me and see what she'll do to me. Willow was stunned. What was wrong with this old woman? Madam is right. Maisie's red lips curled. I'd like to know what plans the Lucas family has for me. Why don't you bring me to see them? Willow turned pale, clenching her fists tightly.